I'm always amazed by how good lots of riders are. They whinge and moan about saying they can't do this, they can't do that. There's a lot of really good riders out there, but what a lot of riders struggle with is putting things together. They can be good at all the individual components, but when it comes to the actual knitting them together in, say, a right hand corner, braking, throttle, tipping, etc., putting them all together, sometimes they struggle. Because people take on information in different ways, it's very difficult to talk about something, in this case braking, in one format. So we talked about it earlier, using just audio, which is basically listening to me drone on. We're going to use visual aids now to try and help. So I've drawn this simple diagram. This simple 90-degree right-hand corner highlights a few things really. Almost everybody can go from 100% brakes and do a really good job of the braking. Almost everybody, when they get to the apex, can drive out the corner. The tricky bit is this bit here, the carrying speed into the corner. So let's go through this diagram in a little bit more detail. Essentially it's the same as the way I talked through it before, but this is actually giving you more of a visual reference of what we're talking about. So approaching a corner something like this, you're coming up to down the straight on full gas, and at this point here it goes full gas to full brakes. Now full brakes is, as we discussed before, is 100% braking. Now in the first part of the braking you want to keep it stable, so that's the roll and squeeze. So you build the pressure up to hard braking in this sector. We then come to the T, which is the start of your tipping point, because you're wanting to follow the natural arc around the corner. So at T, we're still at 100% brakes and we can start the tip into the corner. But from the tipping point to what I call the release point, which is roughly halfway towards the apex, we're tapering the brake off. This tapering the brake off is effectively what most people would interpret as trail braking. You're trailing the brake in towards the corner. Now this is without question the hardest bit of the whole job really. If at this point in the track, your tipping point, you've not carried enough speed, the trailing of the brake is almost useless, because you've got to have enough speed to get you to the apex and keep the throttle closed to allow the bike to turn. A bike will always turn into the corner better on a closed throttle. If you're still at your release point, still very heavy on the brake, and you're trying to get the bike down into the corner, you're actually fighting what the bike's trying to do. The bike's naturally wanting to sit up. You can actually try this yourself by running round a long corner with the brake on, throttle closed, and then release the brake. And as you release the brake, the bike will fall into the corner. So you really need by R to have released the brake and keep the throttle closed to allow the bike to turn. But if there's not enough speed here, you arrive at the apex doing 0 miles an hour. I've broken this particular corner up to start off with basically into two sections. You have the red section, which is from the point you put the brake onto the apex, is all about slowing down, reducing your speed. And from the apex onwards, it's all about accelerating. So it's quite a simple two-part. But there's obviously an awful lot more to it. To simplify it a little bit, you've got really three basic components. You've got your braking aspect, which is from the point you put the brake on to your release point. And then there's nearly always going to be some part of every corner where there's not a lot going on. You're not braking, you're not accelerating, you're just allowing the bike to turn. So there's like a dead section of the corner. Now we want to, in the nicest way, to try to keep that as compact as possible. But then generally speaking, from the apex, it's all about developing the throttle out the corner. Now this bit we're not actually going to talk about too much about in this particular section, because we're all talking at the moment about braking. As I said before, most people can get this section correct. They can use a braking marker point, they can brake late and brake hard. This bit's the tricky bit, because what you don't want at this point is eyes on stalks. You don't want to be too frightened by this point. So this whole exercise is about building up to this point. It's the carrying the speed towards the apex which most people struggle with. Often at the tip-in, it's the point where a lot of people want to get the speed down to the speed that they're going to go around the corner. That means trail braking almost doesn't exist, and it also means they can't keep the throttle closed. They have to get back on the throttle just to get to the corner. And as we discussed before, this causes all sorts of problems with the bike wanting to sit up and drive out, and you end up bouncing off the curbs coming out the corner. So they're keeping the throttle closed and carrying the momentum into the corner, using the bike's momentum to go around the corner. Now, on the assumption that you've built up to this and you've got some sort of a rhythm going, at your tipping point and particularly by your release point, even at your release point, theoretically you should be still going a little bit too fast and allow the engine braking and the closed throttle to get you to this point. Now, in this area here, because you're building up to it, your heart's racing a little bit and you've got a little bit of big eye, but I would suggest, if you've not gone massively over what you've normally done, always get off the brakes, keep the throttle closed and give the corner a go. It's fair to say you may run a little wide coming out the corner, but you've got to try and get yourself encouraged to go into the corner confidently. And the only way you can do it is by building up to it. Now this to me is like a basic theory, a basic how-to. The problem with theories is you have to at some point put them into reality. Now in reality, in the real world, there's a million different sorts of corners that you have to deal with. The shape of the corner, the width of the track, bumps, lumps, inclines, hills, etc. So you have to tailor this sort of technique into the real world situation. Now one of the things which affects the closed throttle and all of this particular part of the corner is inclines, is probably, I would say, the biggest difference. Now two corners which I can use as references here, which hopefully highlight what we're talking about, is say at Brands Hatch, for instance, is going into Paddock Hill. Now at Paddock Hill it's a very track specific corner and is a really tricky corner to get right. Now if this was Paddock Hill, for instance, at your release point you're already going downhill towards the apex. Anyone who's been around Paddock Hill will know what I'm talking about. So the closed throttle there is something you're naturally going to actually do because the bike's running away with you at that point anyway. Another corner to think about this is Hawthorns out on the GP section, which is down the back straight, down the hill, and then the run up and then round Hawthorns. Now at Hawthorns, because of the incline is killing the bike's speed anyway. At the release point going into Hawthorns, the bike's going uphill at this point and the hill is naturally killing the bike's speed. So picking the throttle up, or not waiting till the apex, picking the throttle up slightly before, almost straight away after the release, to keep the bike's momentum going around the corner because of the incline, that's quite important. So this section here, the closed throttle, or if you were looking at a 1, 2, 3 section, section 2 at Hawthorns is almost non-existent. You go straight from a sort of release the brake straight onto the throttle because the hill's killing the speed. Now in the braking area, the type of machine you're on can make a bit of a difference too. Most people, to be honest, on track days are running sort of super sport, super bikes, that sort of thing, 4-cylinder, 2-cylinder, 4-strokes. But that's not all that's out there on track. 2-strokes have their own different problem. It's not really a problem in one sense, but they don't have engine braking as such. So the use of the back brake is a lot more important in this area. Slipper clutches we mentioned in the earlier videos about, they are fitted to most machines nowadays, and basically once you've rolled the throttle off you can feed it a load of gears, the gear that you need for the corner, and it deals with it. If you're riding an older machine or something without a slipper clutch, to keep the bike stable in this section, because if you shut the throttle and go down a couple of gears and the back wheel starts to patter and judder, you need to control that. So the option is you either extend the braking and not brake quite as hard, but if you want to get on the case and start braking hard and you start to encounter that sort of juddering sensation with the back end, a good idea is to actually keep a couple of fingers maybe, lightly, ever so lightly on the clutch itself, and pull the clutch in a tiny bit, put the weight of your fingers almost on the clutch, as if you're sort of trying to find the biting point, and that essentially will actually do the job of what a slipper clutch does. Obviously don't pull the clutch in because you're freewheeling at that point, and that is bad news. It's like jumping into neutral, and anyone who has found a neutral going into the corner knows it's pretty bad news. Another way of helping to control this patterning or juddering that you sometimes get on the bike is to match the engine revs to the gear that you're going down into. What I mean by that is, as you obviously shut the throttle, you're going to be revving at a certain RPM. You change down the gear at the same speed, the revs go up. So as you're sort of slowing down, you blip the throttle, a quick blip of the throttle as you change down the gear, so that when you release the clutch again, the engine revs kind of match. If you, for instance, just shut the throttle and change down the gear and use the clutch and change down to the gears, that's increasing the chances of this engine hopping. What more modern bikes tend to have on them, and you've probably heard the thing where it's called a blipper, which is an electronic system where you literally close the throttle and downshift, and like the quick shifter changing up, what it actually does is it electronically senses what you're trying to do and blips the engine just the right amount to match the engine RPM and the road speed. So use the engine braking, but you do need to control it. So summing up this particular section of the video, when it comes to the visual aid which we're using here, is I try to get people to identify how they're riding, identify the timing of how and when they do things. Simple things that you need to identify when you're building up these references is the actual reference points themselves. Your first and most obvious one, for instance, is your apex of the corner, so you can get the basic arc or the basic line sorted out. Then you need to start to figure out where you need to start braking, and then being able to control the amount of braking that you need to put into the corner, and then control your entry speed, which your entry speed effectively dictates your corner speed. So breaking the corner down again is you've got a section which I call section 1, which is essentially just your braking. Section 2 is that sort of closed throttle dead section of the corner where you're allowing the bike to turn. And section 3 is generally from the apex onwards, and that's all about drive. Now we're going to have a whole video about drive, and we're going to talk about cornering as well. So it's identifying these points which is absolute key.